My friend, in this video, we're gonna be making a disco house song in the style of Dom Dolla, and we're gonna be finding out if we can do it in under 7 days, having it completely mixed and mastered and arranged. So right here is a look at the Ableton project file that we'll be working on. We're using Dom Dolla's song Saving Up as a reference track, and we're gonna be going over recreating the drums, then we're gonna recreate the bass, and then we're going to recreate the melodic elements like the chords and the vocals, and then we're going to be going over the arrangement. And one interesting thing about this composition as I was creating it is it started off as a reference track, so the drums and the bass are similar to the original song Saving Up, but then as I started adding in chords and all the melodic stuff, it ended up changing quite a bit, and now it ended up as a remix of the song I Feel Love by Donna Summer. And same thing, the arrangement started off following the arrangement. So what you can see here is this arrangement track here is Dom Dolla's song Saving Up. I perfectly recreated it, but then as I was actually building up the song, adjusted it. So I'm really hoping that what you can take away from here is how you can start building up a track using a reference, and then slowly start to evolve it into your own original track, creating your own original ideas. And this song, fully arranged, mixed and mastered, ready to go, took about 5 days and about 6 hours, which is pretty fast. So before we dive into this, if you need help finishing songs faster, if that's something important to you, which I think it should be important to any producer really, I've made a completely free ultimate song finishing toolkit that you can download for free. It includes the 5-step song finishing ebook, as well as a collection of samples, presets, and Ableton racks that I use in every single one of my projects to really speed things up and cut down on wasted time. And there's also a third extra special gift that you're gonna have to see for yourself. So with that said, there is a link to that in the description, and it's also on screen now if you want to grab all that for free. And with that said, let's get into this. All right. So we're back in the Ableton project file here, and we are listening to the drums that we'll be recreating. First thing is I'm gonna kind of go through this in the order that I actually created it, so that you'll have a good idea of how you can recreate this to yourself if you were going to go about this. So the very first thing that I built up was the kick drum. So I'll go ahead and just mute all these tracks so we can just focus in on the kick drum. So this is what the kick drum sounds like, and the way that I got this is a particularly special way. And what I did was I'm going to press the S key, and we're listening right now to the actual Dom Dolla song. And essentially what I did to recreate this is I went into this track right here. Let me just pause it. And I found a kick sample. So for example, I think it was potentially this right here. So if we just listen to that, let me just isolate that out for you so you can hear it. So it's just this. So you can hear there's just that kick drum. And essentially what I did is there's this cool technique that I learned from an artist called Dilby. And basically all you do is you isolate the kick drum that you want, and then you drop it into 3 different tracks. So over here, we can see I've labeled this one called high, this one called medium, and this one called low. And within each, what you do is you can set up a multi-band compressor, or you can use an EQ to make sure that there's a high cut on the, you're only listening to the highs on the high track, only the mids on the mid track, and only the lows on the low track. Then you can consolidate those individual tracks, and then you'll see when you consolidate them, the highs will just show how much sample is remaining for each of these frequency lengths. And then you can then adjust the lengths to kind of remove any of the other sounds. So you can see there's a lot has been removed here from the high end to kind of get rid of that like high end kind of hi-hat sounds or any of those kind of sounds. And a little bit less has been removed from the mids, a little bit even less has been removed from the low end. And then what we end up with is, let's turn this off. Then we end up is this. Then I just dropped that sample that I ended up coming up with there, dropping it into a MIDI clip here, threw it in. In terms of processing, what we have is just a bit of saturation. And then at the end, I have this last little bit here. You can see I changed the color. I added an auto filter just on this. So whenever I put this in, there'll be kind of that low cut kind of sound that's pretty common in dance music. So that's a look at the drums. If you want a more detailed explanation tutorial of that process, let me know and I can make a dedicated video explaining it in a lot more detail. But the main thing is, once isolating the drums, the main thing that I did was I set up so that this reference track here, the solo key, is mapped to the S on my keyboard, so I could flick between them back and forth. And what I did was, once finding that kick sound, I'd flick back and forth and try to get the volume of my kick to be the same volume of the actual kick. And that's really important, because what I've been finding is that volume is like 80% of the way. That's kind of the 80-20 rule of mixing here, getting the volumes right. Then I just added a little bit of saturation and that was it. Then the next thing that I added in was this top loop. Actually, yeah. So what I went for here is, if you can hear, the main thing I was looking for was that, like, the open hat, the open hat, that kind of like rhythm is what I could hear when listening to the reference track. Open hat, open hat, open hat. So like that. So if you listen back and forth, like that. So I looked for I think I just looked up disco drum loops potentially. Ended up finding one that kind of had the vibe, and I had to cut it up a little bit so that open hi-hat was happening on the last bar of every 4 bars. And then just change it up so that it doesn't happen in the last little bit. In terms of processing here, just removing a bunch of lows to make room for like the kick drum, primarily a bit of 1 knob sidechain, a bit of 1 knob saturation, and a bit of 1 knob width. Again, if you want a little bit more of detail of how I go about doing this kind of mixing as you go process, this is the channel strip that loads up every time that I'm working on any track, because I'll always be making slight adjustments by removing some of the lows, potentially side chaining, add a bit of saturation and width. If you want to learn a bit more about that as well, let me know in the comments. The next thing that I added in was the hi-hat. And this, if you look at the MIDI, is mostly just like that every other beat kind of standard hi-hat. And then every few notes I just changed, so it's a different sample triggering, just to add a little bit of groove and character. And I think if we listen back to the reference, it's mostly just an open hi-hat. So this was just something I added for a little bit of extra groove and character for mine. Next thing we'll look at is the claps. Oh, and I guess let's look at if there's any processing. In terms of processing, no, just straight up hi-hat. So that is what it is. Next up, we have this clap. So if we look at the clap, the main thing is that it's a clap where you'd expect it to, the 2, 4, 2, 4, and then at the end, there's that ka-ka. So if you listen to the track, that kind of idea is the main thing there. And again, when setting the levels, I was flicking back and forth, trying to get the sound correct there. In terms of the processing, removing some of the lows, adding some saturation to bring in some of the other harmonics, kind of fill up the sound, and then using this 1 knob width plugin to move things to the side a little bit. Next, we have the snare, which is, the pattern is very similar. It's on the 2 and the 4. And then for this one, I've set it so that it does that cat-cat kind of idea every 2 bars. In terms of the sound design and the volumes, again, the main thing was flicking back and forth, trying to get the sound right and the volumes right. Then in terms of processing, standard stuff, removing some of the lows, no sidechain on this. I wanted to just come through fully, some saturation to fill up the sound, no width or anything like that. It's kind of taking care of the middle, the claps are taking care of the sides. Next up is the open hi-hat. And there's a couple of things that I did here. One is you'll see there's a Freeze 14 Dom Dolla. So basically what I did here is I just went back into the reference track. We'll listen to that again. And I found a slice where that open hat was playing by itself, grabbed it, and then dropped it into this drum rack here. And if we go back to it, you can see I have the Dom Dolla one playing, and I've also reinforced it with another sound that I liked. So taking the sample is one thing, and then also reinforcing with other sound to kind of increase, like have a different character to it, and also to fill out the sound a little bit more. In terms of the sound design, using the actual sound helps a lot. So that's one thing. And then going back and forth again between the reference and then our track to get the volumes right is really the main key thing. Again, we have a little bit of some one knob saturation. Well, one knob, this is what the actual saturator looks like. I've just set up for one knob. This is what it looks like when you do it by itself, just using the Ableton saturator, bringing the drive up a bunch, and then kind of bringing the volume back a little with the output. Using the transient designer a little bit to get rid of decrease the sustain of the note, so it tightens it up a little bit, and then a little bit of one knob width pushing to the side. And that's the drums for the most part. Then there also is this track here. These little fills. So if you listen, there's like a reverse sound. Another one right here with a fill. And then another reverse sound. And then a reverse sound with a fill. And now we'll listen to ours. Reverse. Reverse sound with a fill. And basically what I did here was I just grabbed the samples that I was using, the snares and the clap sounds in these tracks here, reverse them on an audio track by pressing the R key, and just set them up so that they're swelling into the where the notes should be played. And then I found this little drum fill, and I found another drum fill. Just found those on Splice. They sounded pretty similar and kind of cool. Mix them in by flicking back and forth between the reference. And boom, there we have it. So that's a look at the drums. I also have as far as the final mix goes, I left the kick on its own. I was liking how it was sounding just as it is. But all the drums, the tops, hi-hats, claps, snares, open hats, etc., I grouped that together into a group called drums. I have some light compression going for about 2 decibels of gain reduction or so with a pretty fast attack, super fast release. Then that 2 decibels gain reduction, kind of bringing it back with the oxygen inflator, which is basically a saturator, going with some very minimal amounts of the effect here, trying to oversaturate my stuff too much. And then finally going into a K clip where I'm shaving off about 0.4 decibels and bring up the volume a little bit to compensate for what was lost from the compressor. All right. So now back here in Ableton, what we're listening to is just the drums and the bass soloed out so we can focus on this. What you can see here is, I do have this Dom Dolla saving up track that will be bouncing back and forth between. So if I press the S on my keyboard, this is the Dom Dolla track that we will be recreating. So let's have a look at the bass here. So starting off, the first thing that I'll usually do when recreating the bass is I'll start off by figuring out the MIDI. So in this example, I don't know if this song is originally in G sharp. If you listen back, I think it's a different tuning. So what I ended up doing was I copied the pattern, which is just this like kind of whatever this would be offbeat kind of pattern, just pedaling on the same note, and then the last 2 notes it changes up. So I kind of copied that pattern, and I ended up changing the key simply so that I could evolve this into my own original song after using the reference as a kickoff point. So the way that I did this was simply by listening to the actual track and then recreating it slowly, trying to find the right key, trying to find the right notes, and then recreating it just basically by ear like that. Another thing that you can do to help is there's websites. So all you can do, like, look up Dom Dolla saving up key and BPM on Google, and it should also give you a rough idea of what the key is to give you a good starting off point. That's another trick for you there. So what I'll usually do when recreating this is I'll focus on just this one sound here. So right here is a sub sound, and I'll always usually start off the bass sounds with a sub sound. It's almost a similar idea of if you're trying to figure out something, you start on a piano because it's the most simplest sound, and then you can get into the sound design later and you can really focus on the notes. That's kind of the same idea that I go about creating my basses. And I also like to have my subs on a separate track so that the subs is a very simple sub sine bass, and it's filling up the low end, and then the mid bass comes in additional layers to add the character of the bass. So in terms of the sub sound, I'm using a preset called Subs You Can Hear from a really cool producer. His YouTube channel is called Seed to Stage, and this was a free download, so definitely check it out. But essentially all it is a sub sound, like a sine wave, where you can add some saturation and additional harmonics to allow it to be better heard on laptop speakers and those kinds of things, and cut through the mix a bit more. Other than that, I do have this like little channel strip that I'll sometimes throw on my tracks, But the main thing is that I'm using a one knob sidechain that's just going to quarter notes instead of like linking it to the kick drum or anything like that. I find it a lot faster. This is actually one of the things that you can download for free in that thing that I was talking about. And then let's move on. So then moving into the more, I guess, sound design section of this, the next part is I have this next track called Mids. And what this is instead, you might notice that it added a sound without any MIDI playing. And the way that I do this is if you set a MIDI channel to in, like you can see here, and then you can select which channel you want the MIDI to feed into. So you see I selected subs. So this means that the MIDI from subs is going to be going into this channel to trigger the sounds here. So this way it's a lot easier you don't have to like copy and paste the MIDI over and over again, particularly if it's going to be playing the same sound. It's a lot easier to deal with, and that's how I prefer to work. Tip for if you want to go that way. How I've ended up processing this is pitched it down 12 semitones. It's needed that compared to the sound of the subs there. And I'm using this bass sample that I basically grabbed from a VST that I like and threw it into Ableton, so it wasn't loading this huge VST. So now it's just using the samples instead. What I'm doing is removing about the lows around 200 hertz is where the cutoff is there, so that the subs will come through. So this is mostly just the mid character. The subs is all being taken care of by the actual sub track. Then the main other thing that you're going to want to pay attention to here is, again, I have that one knob side chain, which is just making room for the kick and adding that kind of fun bounce. The next thing that we have going on here is a Moog sound. And so what I did here was I just found a Moog one-shot sample from Splice and then dropped it into a simpler here on Ableton. And that way it's going to play the notes as it plays. And this is where I decided to get a little bit more unique and creative with the sound. I think ultimately what you're listening to in the Dom Dolla track is really just, if you listen to it, is probably just some kind of Moog kind of analog sound, which is cool, but it's not really my vibe. So I wanted to kind of recreate that a little bit in what we have here. So let's go ahead and solo up let's go ahead and solo this out how we had it. So we had it with the subs, mid, and this Moog sound. And so basically what I did is, like I said, dropped in a one-shot sample of that Moog bass, dropped it in here. Then what I have here is this spectral resonator. If I turn it off, that's how it sounds without it. And with it, basically, it's kind of changing the sound a bit. So with the spectral resonator, you can set the mode to MIDI and then decide where the MIDI is going to come from. And then it's going to change the spectral sound of the audio following the notes of the MIDI track that you've linked it to. So now it's again following the MIDI track there to adjust the sound using this interesting spectral resonator kind of sound. Then other than that, we have most of the lows getting cut out at 146 hertz, making room for the sub once again, and then crank the side chain here so that it is bouncing quite a bit. And then the last thing that I did here is this extra layer. You can hear that. Let's turn it off. Turn it back on. So this is a weird one for sure. So what I did here is there has been something that I've been playing around with, a plugin called SIMPLANT. And what you can do is similar to how in the previous video when I mentioned I extracted out the hi-hat and used it in the drums that I recreated. I also extracted out a layer of the bass and then I dropped it into this program here called SIMPLANT. And what's cool about it is what it'll do is you can drop an audio sample into this and it'll try to recreate it using AI. So as you can hear, if we listen to this maybe on its own, it doesn't really sound that much like the original sound. I do have the spectral resonator on. We'll turn that off. Even less like it. So when I threw it in, the tonality was wrong. And then this is a good example. When you throw the spectral resonator on and then attach the MIDI so that it's coming from one of the notes that you actually want it to play, it can force it into a more melodic kind of sound. Again, more unique when compared to the original tune, but I thought it's interesting. And overall, the vibe is there, but it's definitely a little bit more unique, so I can then transfer it into a more original song. I'm not trying to fully just recreate this tune at the end of the day. I'm writing songs every single week so that I can use the references to get better and better at mixing and sound design and choosing stuff, but ultimately I want to be able to transfer it over to an original composition, which we'll get into in a future video. But with that said, huge ramble. Sorry, hopefully that was useful. But yeah, so we're using that SIMPLANT AI kind of sound. Then what we're doing is we're moving a bunch of the lows to make room for the sub. And we're using a little bit of that one knob width that I've been talking about to push it to the sides a little bit so that the subs is mostly taking up the middle. Then we're running into that spectral resonator, linking it to the sub MIDI so that it's following the notes a lot tighter. And then I'm using a transient designer to remove some of the sustain so the notes are a bit tighter. Then we have a one knob sidechain to have it bounce against the kick. And then we have a one knob saturation so that it's filling out more of the frequency range and filling out the sound a little bit more. That there is a look at the bass. Again, if we flick back to the original, the note selection, like the pattern, is pretty on, but the sound design that I ended up with is similar, but definitely more unique and usable for something else. But yeah, huge little ramble there. In the next video, we'll be going over the synths, which sound a little bit like this. And definitely went down a different route when adding in the synth. So it's an interesting aspect to start stuff as it with a reference track and then slowly evolve into your own unique creative composition. And that sounds like something you'll be interested in. All right. So let's dive into this. So this is going to be an interesting one because usually what I've been doing with this video series, the idea is to reference the tracks and try to make it sound kind of similar to the original reference. In this example, I wasn't really feeling the original reference, and the goal with these is for me to always create something original that I can end up releasing. So I ended up kind of going off, and I'll show you kind of the process. So in this video, what we're really going to be doing, I should probably find a part without the vocals. So freaking nice though. Can't wait to show you how I did that. So I'm back here. So we'll get a loop going, so that way there's not two voices here. But yeah, so the idea here is the inspiration I really want you to take away with is how you can use a reference track to build out your songs and make sure all of the levels are great and sounding professional, but then pivoting and starting to make your own original tune and getting a little bit more creative and making interesting choices so that you have something original that you can release. It's interesting that you can start with referencing something like that and then get to a point that's distinguishable from the original tune that you're referencing. So that's really what I hope to kind of have you take away from this. So when recreating this tune, I kind of want to show you the order in which I created things. So I'm just going to start turning off a few of these instruments here. Okay, boom. So right now what we're listening to is just the bass and the drums. And so when I was starting to recreate it, I wasn't really digging. There wasn't too much like stuff going on in the reference track. So I started kind of just getting more creative. One of the first things I added was this Rhodes. So originally I was trying to recreate the kind of Rhodes sound that was in that track, and it ended up just going for more of a chilled out vibe. So basically I just looked up a Rhodes chord on Splice and just dropped it in here and set it up so that it's dropping on the one, but then the second time it's coming in, it's like dropping in on the half measure there. Then the third time it's coming in on the 2. Then the second time it's coming on the 2.5, and then it resets so that it's coming on 1. So it's like a weird kind of like almost like polyrhythm that's happening. But since it's just like such a mellow, chilled out chord, it doesn't sound too annoying, I guess. It sounds smooth. So in terms of the processing, what I did is I have the spectral resonator on. It's set to C sharp, which I believe is somewhat in the key of this tune, which is G sharp, and added set to this chorus effect. So if we turn it off and on, it's pretty subtle. I actually kind of like it without it too, to be honest. But spectral resonator is an interesting plugin. You can definitely start to make your stuff sound more unique with using that. Then we're removing much of the lows to make room for the kick and the bass. We have a one knob side chain going on here, and if you want to learn a little bit more about this is essentially like the channel strip that I have that goes automatically on each one of my tracks as I'm building it, because I'm almost always going to be removing some lows, potentially doing some transient shaping, usually adding in side chain, usually adding in some saturation to fill out the tune a bit, and usually doing some width to move it out of the middle and move it to the sides, fill it out more and make space for the stuff in the middle. if you want more, it's like a dedicated video on how I go about mixing as you go and how you could build your own customized channel strip, let me know and I will go into that. But for this particular track, main thing is the lows are being removed. We have some sidechain going on, and I have this utility that is increasing the volume at certain points of the tune. It's just a volume automation. It's basically what's happening. The idea is to, if you're going to have the volume change throughout the track, it's better to do it on a utility strip like this using the gain instead of doing it right here on the channel strip, because if you need to make any slight adjustments as you go, it makes it really messy. So we started with this. I started with this one, and it didn't seem quite enough, so I panned it a bit to the left and wanted to add an additional chord layer. We'll turn on the next layer that I ended up adding. And so what this is, you can hear it, another kind of Rhodes kind of sound that I found in the same key. And what I did is I cut it up a bunch and threw it on, I cut it up to change the chord notes so that it's playing nicely with the bass line, basically. In terms of the processing on this, now the same spectral resonator kind of sound on both of these, removing the lows, one knob sidechain, and again, a little bit of that same gain automation's happening with this one. Basically, the arrangement part of it, I have it slowly, the volume slowly bringing in the sound. Then in terms of over the group processing, I put them together into a little group called chords. And what I added was this really, really cool plugin called Portal. It's kind of a granular synthesis kind of plugin. And I've created my own little preset of it. So I can show you a video of this if you want to learn how to do this. You can take any kind of third-party plugin that you have and then set up macros on it. So that way, what I have here is usually the mix and the depth is, with this plugin, it sounds interesting to slowly bring in the dry and wet and change that over time. So I set up my own custom little preset where it has an LFO already attached to the mix knob of the plugin, so that with just a couple of changes here, I can make it so that mix knob is slowly cycling through with an LFO. If you want to learn how to do that, let me know. I'll mention it in a future video just dedicated to that. Then I have a compressor going on here with around 3:1 ratio, pretty fast attack, and the release set to auto. I think we're going for between 2, 3, sometimes even 5 decibels of gain reduction, just to kind of tighten up the sound a bit and reduce the dynamic range. And then we're bringing in some back that volume and adding in some fullness with a saturator. That is the chords, and this is really the main kind of idea of the tune here, that it ended up kind of like the direction it ended up heading in. What I did after that was this layer here, which is super interesting. So we listen to it by itself. It's basically a bunch of weird noises, and what's really cool about this is what I did was, I should have this somewhere in here. Over here, what I did was I separated out the instrumental of the Dom Dolla Saving Up track from the drums by plugging it into a tool called lala.ai, so it was able to separate out the instrumentals. And if we just pause the tune here for a second and listen to just this. So that's basically the idea. So I was able to separate all that out from the original track using that AI. And that allowed me to then take little cuts of the instrumental track, and I dropped it into a plugin called SIMPLANT. I had to freeze this because SIMPLANT is a little heavy. But essentially, I took little stabs from the original tune, dropped it into SIMPLANT, and then SIMPLANT also uses AI to try to find options for synthesis based on any audio sample that you drop in. So as you can hear, it's super weird and wild and nothing like how it actually turned out. So sometimes it can be cool where it can sound like it can recreate the audio sample that you plug into it very well, which is super useful, but sometimes it won't. But even when it does it, it can come up with some pretty interesting sounds that you can use to create some unique sound design. So that's essentially what each one of these are. If I slowly solo each one, this was one of the slices of the Dom Dolla track, ended up sounding like a little like that. And I slowly added in a bunch of different sounds. And that's how that kind of came to be. So it's an interesting way to use AI to come up with some unique sounds. Then finally, that's all going over top of this, they're all grouped together in this group called AI samples. And what I've done is I set up a spectral resonator and set it to the key of the song that I'm working in, which is G sharp, which then, if I turn this off, you hear, if you can hear that, let me solo it again. You can hear how dissonant and weird and creepy that is. But then if you turn on the spectral resonator, you can force the audio into a specific key, which is super cool, super interesting. So I threw that on there to make sure that it's actually in the key of the tune. I used the utility to move the balance of the left. For some reason, I wanted to do that way, which is a little weird, but it is what it is. Then we're moving a bunch of the lows, shelving out some of the highs. Here's a big part of the sound. I'm using this portal granular kind of effect. So I think if I turn that off, it's even weirder. So let's solve this again. So this is the weird AI plugin. And then with a portal sound, which I'm probably using a preset. Yeah, Pentamin in 5, so it's also doing some kind of like harmonic changes. Again, pushes into more of a smoother sounding, usable sound. It's still weird, but got that. And then doing a bit of 1-up sidechain, some 1-up saturation to fill up the sound a little bit. And that's the AI samples there. What else do we have here? There is another synth part that I'm going to show you, but what we'll do next is I want to show you the vocals. So I wanted to use a different vocal sample so that I could also release this as an edit. And what I ended up choosing was Donna Summer's I Feel Love. So let's have that come to play in next here. So I use this little swell part. I had to pitch it down 1 semitone to make it in key. And what's interesting about that, let me just get a little loop going here so I can explain something without vocals happening. So the Donna Summer song is in, I believe it's like C major, and we are in G sharp minor. And so what I did was I moved it down to B major, and B major is the relative major of G sharp minor, which means that they share the same note. So even though this sample is in the major key, it works against the minor notes of the rest of the composition because it's the relative major sharing the same notes. Music theory stuff, it's probably the one music theory thing that I know pretty well, but that's it. Let's keep listening through to this. And here's the main part. Pretty cool. In terms of the processing, what do we have going on here? This I'll come back to in a moment. I have the spectral resonator in the same key again. Oops, turn that off. That's not part of it. Okay. Using the spectral resonator to force it into the right key again. Removing some of the lows. Some side chain. 1 knob saturation to fill it out a bit. Using the 1 knob width to push it to the sides a little. Widen it up. And then I also have this Nectar plugin turning on just some of the notes that I thought were kind of sounding out of key. And that's kind of the song's breakdown there. The last thing I want to show you is what I did do, the synth that we're listening to here that comes into this point. So what I did for this one is I used SIMPLANT once again, and the audio sample that I used to trigger the AI was the actual synth sound from the Donna Summer's track, I Feel Love. It sounds different from that original track, but still interesting. All right. So now we're gonna do a playthrough of this track, and I'm gonna give notes on the arrangement as we go through it. Right now, we're in the first 8 bars of the track, which is an intro, just kind of the drums. And we have a small micro change with the kick being high pass. And now the sub gets introduced. So at this point, this is going to happen for, I believe, 32 bars. So we have the first 8 bars happening, and slowly over time, we have this chord progression slowly increasing volume, so it's building up energy in the track. We just had some of these weird little samples coming in, and we're gonna have a little vocal tease right about now as we go into the last 8 bars of this section. So in this last 8 bars, we also added in this ride to add some additional energy in this 8 bar section. And we have the down lifter going into a laser and down sound as well to the first break. And also had that vocal go into it. So now we've removed the kick, basically high passed it so that it produces some of the energy so that we can then go into the first verse. Main change here is the vocal, of course. At the end of this 8 bar, there's a little reverse crash going into the next 8 bars. And overall, this verse is 16 bars. And we're gonna go into a break right now. And to lead into it, we have a down lifter sound, down riser, and a reverse crash. So now we have this break. We've removed the kick to drop the energy down and introduce the main vocal. And then we have a little laser sound in between to have some interest, and then a riser sound, reverse crash into a crash chorus. Also at this point, the bass has changed. So instead of just pedaling on one note, it's doing more of a chord progression. First 8 bars of the chorus, second 8 bars, we're gonna add a little ride there, increasing the energy a bit more. And then we have some down kind of riser sounds and a reverse crash going into the post-chorus, which is the same beat, but we've changed out the vocal and instead introduced this synth line. So it's changing the kind of the focus of the tune. Okay, and then last 8 bars before we go into the verse. So at this point is where we're no longer going to be using the Dom Dolla reference track. At this point, it went into a second verse. I didn't have the vocals for it in what I was doing, so I ended up going for like a big build-up kind of sound. So removed all of the drums. We have the chords still playing, some of that, the synth being filtered out, and we have this pad slowly rising in. Also on the master track, I added in a crystallizer and this weird Valhalla supermassive kind of reverb, making just weird granular sounds come in and slowly rising in that reverb to give kind of a swelling effect that you're going to hear over time. And we slowly are going to be introducing more and more drums, hi-hats. You can see here, 16 bars of claps, 16 bars without claps and snares. Then we added in the hi-hat for 16 bars. And then again, I'm gonna keep changing things every 16 bars, 8 bars or so. Those are always 8 bar changes. So now we're adding in some of the vocals slowly filtering in. The bass is playing, but the subs have been removed. Slowly building up the energy. There is this 909 roll, slowly automating in the volume, so slowly increasing the energy. What else do we got going on here? Slowly increasing the reverb on the master channel, so the supermassive, making it all weird, washed out. Keep on building it up, and then we're gonna have 8 bars of pause, building up to this break. And then little drum fill. Boom, to the final drop of the tune. At this point, what we're gonna do is make changes every 8 or 16 bars. So in the first, 16 bars, we have no open hi-hat. In the next one, open hi-hat adds a bit more energy. Go down over here, we can see there's lasers happening every 8 bars. And we have another reverse sound and reverse crash going in the next section here, where we're gonna add another bit of energy, which is this ride. Boom. Also in this last one, we introduced a pad sound in that huge buildup, and now we have that pad sound playing in this last drop. It wasn't in any previous drops. The idea is to make it so that every drop is a bit more unique. Then we have kind of this last little build down part where filtered out some of the kick, and then a micro transition removing the kick completely into a standard 16 bar outro. So you can hear now there's just whatever has been fading away in terms of the melodic instruments. We just have the drums. We have the first 8 bars playing with the kick full. Then we have the second half of that, since it's been an 8 bar change. We have the high pass removing some of the kick, so it's kind of changing the energy. And then a micro channel just removing the kick altogether. Boom. Track complete. Hello again, my friend. Hopefully you found that video useful. If you'd like to follow along yourself with the 5-step song finishing checklist, there will be a link in the description below where you can get access to that completely for free, and it's going to help you finish your songs a lot faster and better than ever before. If you found this video useful, like and subscribe and all that good stuff, but really the best thing I can do for you is hook you up with that free checklist, so make sure you check that one. Other than that, I'll see you in the next video, my friend. Have a good one.